Welcome to the latest episode of Defense Disrupted. My name is Ian Kalin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Turbine One, and I'm honored truly to be joined here by Lieutenant General retired Bob Ashley. This gentleman almost needs no introduction, but just in case there's a few folks that are new to this world, Bob Ashley has served in an extraordinary number of roles in the U.S. Army. Some of his latest rounds of service include being the 21st Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was also the DAG2, which for those that don't know exactly what that means, kind of means he was the head of intel for the Army. Many years in service and continues to be incredibly active in the community. Bob, welcome so much to Defense Disrupted.
No, I appreciate it. It's good to be with you. I look forward to the conversation today. And 45th Army G2, because now the current G2 introduces himself as the 48th. So we're tracking those numbers as well.
Well, we're going to get into the data, sir. We're going to get into the numbers. I'll start with a quick question. In your years of service, you changed a great number of things. You uphold great traditions, but you changed one tradition in particular. And while some folks are not going to be able to see this podcast, they're only listening to it, I'm going to hold something up on the screen here. And I'd love for you to describe what is this and why is this so different? So, sir, can you please explain what this is?
That is a gift that I got from my oldest son, Sean, who was an audio engineer, and something that I gave you. So I've been a struggling guitar player for the past 30 plus years. And when I got promoted to Lieutenant General before I took over as the Army G2, my son gave me a gift, and it was guitar picks with 3 stars on it. So that's a very personal thing for my son, and I was happy to share one of them with you as well.
And if I may, some folks share coins. You share guitar picks. So what is the tradition of the coins for those that aren't as familiar with this world? And I know there's a lot of folks who know you, but what would make that a little bit funny for those that aren't as familiar?
Yeah, so it's called a challenge coin, and you give it to somebody for excellence. Somebody does a great job, you pull a coin out, and you award it to a soldier, sailor, airman, marine, civilian, contractor. And when I was at DIA, it was different because you had a chance you can personalize it. So if you're in an Army unit, it's got the Army logo and things like that. At DIA, you can personalize, you can actually put your signature on it. So what I did is I crowdsourced the design, and the folks at DIA realized I'm a big Beatles fan. So they came back with the lettering on the coin said the director, and the lettering style of the director. And for those who can see, the T in the director dropped down like the Beatles. And so that was in the middle. You can sign it. And then there was a series of concentric circles, really, really tight. Think a vinyl album. And so I got several different recommendations, and that was the one that resonated with me most, and that became the director's coin while I was the director at DIA.
Well, sir, in that tradition of influencing the next generation of those that are trying to modernize national security, I've taken your lead, and for those that cannot see, we at Turbine One give out T1 guitar picks.
There we go.
Only those that have accomplished greatness in the field. Sir, well, with that story, that'll be a transition to my first question about your extraordinary career. And it's about the role of mentorship. My first question here. I asked a whole lot of people what I should be asking General Bob Ashley about. And you have so many stories about you. You seem to have mentored more people than I think I know. I don't know how much time you have for that physically, but it seems to be at least your reputation. And one of the more interesting stories about you that I heard, and sincerely, even though I may know you a little bit, I was like, I don't know anything about this. I want to learn more about. You apparently had a relationship of mentoring with Fox Connor. Who is Fox Connor, sir, and what did he teach you?
Yeah, so I didn't meet Fox Connor. Fox Connor was a general in World War II, and there's a book called The Gray Eminence. And what I do is I kind of pay it forward. There's not a lot of people that have heard of him, but he played a critical role in mentoring 3 individuals. And so just imagine if you're writing your resume and somebody said, so tell me about your impact. And this individual would say, well, okay, here's my impact. I mentored probably the premier warfighter of World War II. I mentored a Supreme Allied commander. I mentored a chief of staff of the Army, a secretary of defense, secretary of state, and the president of the United States. I think that's a pretty good resume. Well, Fox Connor, when he was a general officer, was a key mentor for General Patton, General Marshall, and General Eisenhower. And so that story is unpacked in The Gray Eminence, and it talks about his relationship with them. I think one of the great stories is when they got ready for the D-Day invasion, Marshall and Eisenhower, back in the day when everything's on paper, sent the orders over to him. He had retired, and they said, if you'd be so kind to review these. And so that's the level of impact that Fox Connor has as a mentor. But if you throw out the names Patton, Eisenhower, Marshall, everybody goes, yep, I know all three of those. But if you go, who's Fox Connor, they'll just have, for the most part, a blank look on their face unless they have something in the story. So that just, it's kind of the old adage is, you plant the seeds to the tree under the shade that you'll never enjoy. And that's really what Fox did. He just gave tremendous contributions to us in the way of those three individuals and what they did for the nation.
And you, sir, seem to be paying that forward in your own activities now after many years of service. Again, it's hard to wrangle the number of folks who consider you their coach, either in a personal life or quite often in the professional life. So again, in asking about you, I'm going to hit on some high points, a few points of recent history. And I hear you have a rather interesting story in terms of where you were on 9/11 and the work that followed. Obviously, we're in an unclassified environment, but to the extent that you can share some of the memories from that iconic day, is there anything that you'd be willing to teach us here about what you saw back then?
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting where I was on 9/11 as I was sitting around a conference table at what was then Fort Gordon. And we were in the middle of getting ready to have an IG outbrief, so an inspector general. And as we're sitting there, we're starting the discussion on the battalion commander at the time, and then brigade commanders in there because we're getting looked at by the IG. A warrant officer walks in, a Marine warrant officer walks in and says, hey, just want to let you guys know that, not sure, but it looks like a small plane has flown into one of the towers in the World Trade Center. And so we go on with the interim briefing with the inspector general team, and then he comes back in a few minutes later and says, the second tower was hit, we're at war. And that was kind of how, I found out that 9/11. And so literally the briefing stopped, and the role and mission of that particular organization was critical to Central Command. So it was part of the National Security Agency enterprise. And so at that point, we started doing an inventory of everything that we had. We started looking at, all the threat streams that were coming in. So that was kind of how 9/11 started for me, was sitting around a conference table, and what was a beautiful morning when I went to work.
You were at the table. You had that perspective. Marching forward a bit, you also spent many years supporting the conflict in Afghanistan. And I think now, publicly, you are on a commission or a group seeking to gather the lessons learned from that experience. Not to disclose in advance the work of that great report, but to the extent that you can share why you were invited to that level of retrospection, and anything that you could maybe give a preliminary, no breaking news here, but any aspects of that process that is worth sharing.
Yeah, so it's a bipartisan commission. It was established by both the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress, and they selected 16 commissioners of varied backgrounds. And so I'm the one from the intel side of the house, and every commissioner had someone that was selected. So it was 8 on the Dems, 8 on the Republicans. And Senator Warner, who was the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, through his staff, reached out and asked me if I'd be willing to sit on the commission. I said, of course, I'd be absolutely honored. And so it's a 3-year charter to look at all 20 years of the war in Afghanistan, really for lessons learned. And so we're in the 2nd year. We've had a number of public hearings. And so if you want to go to the Afghan War Commission website, you can track when the next hearing is, because we're going to have another one in the fall. We've got a second interim report that'll be due out here in the next couple of months. And so it's an incredibly talented team of commissioners with a wealth of experience, both on the policy side and actually in the war itself, from operators that were kicking in doors to me as an intel guy to ambassadors and other individuals. And so a wealth of insights, people that were involved over the course of the 20 years. And really, this is, you could look at it as 9/11 Part 2, the 9/11 report, Part 2, to tell the rest of the story of what happened in the 20 years. And really the takeaways are, what should we be learning as a nation? What should we be learning as a Defense Department, as a government, as we go forward and we start looking at, future conflicts? And so that's really the charter we have. The final report is due out in the August-September timeframe of 2026.
Okay, but that's an interesting point, though, in terms of like the Part 2 the 9/11 Commission. I remember waiting for that to come out, buying the book, reading it. I think I don't remember where maybe I was in grad school at the time, but I tried to study that intensely, and so I think the importance of this research and the commission that you're in is obviously extremely valuable. But it does set this framework, right? That we have these milestones of conflict, and you mentioned that you're brought in as the intel guy. So let's dig into that a little bit. Can you share how you've seen intel transform over those milestones? Because you were in service before 9/11, you saw it transform. Afghanistan transform again, and of course, the question I'll ask in 15 minutes is where is it going to go in the future? But just with with a look back, what can you share about how, from the intel guy's perspective, how things have changed over those milestones?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. The capabilities that young lieutenants, young intel analysts have at their fingertips as opposed to where I was. And so let me go back to when I came on active duty. So I was commissioned in 1984, and they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to go." When I left Appalachian State, when I graduated, I said, "Hey, I want to be a paratrooper. I want to go to the 82nd Airborne and down at Fort Bragg." And I got my wish. And so I started off the intel battalion, but really the relevant story is when I became an intelligence officer in 1987 for an infantry battalion. Right. So I'm the S2. That's the intel guy for one of the battalions in 1st Brigade of the 82nd. And so when we would go out for exercises, what I had was what I had in my head. I would have a map board. I would have some alcohol pins. And that was about it. And the only intel capability.
Wait, sorry, sir. Sorry. What is an alcohol pin? Wait, so stop. You said a word I don't
So
understand.
you have a map and you have acetate on the map. And then you had an alcohol pin, these Statler Mars pins that you could write on so that if it rained or whatever, it didn't blur. But you would always have a thing of rubbing alcohol with you because that's how you would clean your board.
Oh,
so
funny.
just imagine, yeah.
Yeah, so I had a wax pencil in the Navy, but it was easy to just rub it off. But if you're in the field, you needed okay. Got
Exactly.
it. Yeah, got
Right. So just imagine you're flying over. It's about 1,500 feet. You've got your rucksack in front of you, and inside that rucksack is a radio, which is called a PRC 77. So you got this FM radio. You got your map board, your food, everything else. Everything that you had went in that rucksack. And so that's 1987, right? And then you fast forward to where we are right now, and that young intel analyst, that young officer, is going to hit that ground. They're going to grab a laptop and they're going to turn that thing on, and they're going to find themselves, connected to a tactical internet, and they're going to be able to pull down imagery from the national, pick your 3-letter agency, whether it's signals intelligence, imagery. So it has gone that far to flatten that hierarchy of what was. I had to go to the brigade to ask the division would ask the corps would reach into the intel agencies. And so there was this hierarchy of, because you didn't have the capability, all you could do was ask the question for the information, and you eventually had to get somebody that would provide it to you. And so if somebody said, what was the most consequential change that allowed you to do that? And I would tell you it's communications. The fact that I could get on a laptop, get on a network, download top secret information, those are the kind of things that were really the most powerful, because what it really did is it put through the internet, through the tactical internet, everything that the IC had became available. Now that was something that transpired over time in the war on terrorism, because initially the 3-letter agencies would hold very close a lot of those databases. They would send an LNO into Afghanistan or an LNO into Iraq. And that was the one person that could get access to a digital database. And so if you said, hey, I need to understand who is the person that's behind this cell phone number. Okay, well, then let me reach that and I'll go in the database and stuff and I'll start looking at it. But fast forward about 5, 6, 7 years into that, the tactical units had access to that database. They could do their own queries. And so they realized you couldn't have this stovepipe where you had to go through an LNO from a national support team, because they used to have these NIST teams, national support teams, that you would get LNOs from the IC, from the intelligence community, would embed in a headquarters. And those are really only at kind of like the division, corps, or the Joint Special Operations Task Force. And so going from having a national support team to get access to this information, it was at your fingertips. And that's where we are today. that you can tap into all of this stuff. And that's a huge change from, First Lieutenant Ashley jumped in with a couple of a couple of pencils and pens and a map board on a piece of cardboard, that he could break out.
Has there been a history in the tension of that flattening? So let's talk about that. So X years ago, I had to go up the chain to get the data. That means that someone at a senior level consolidates the requests, understands the information, sends it back out. But if it's flattened, if I can get the data farther forward, that means that you're actionable farther forward. You don't have to reach back to get information or to take action on it. So I would imagine, and I'm thinking ahead to the level of an echelons of decision making, which is a future question. But I want to better understand, Steve, in the past, did that lead to tension points fundamentally over the past 10, 15, 20 years where folks were like, well, the junior folks, the lower levels, they're getting all this data. They don't need to reach back to senior command to even get the information. So if they're getting all this information sooner, faster, closer to the threat, has there been a cultural organizational tension in that information going further forward and forward and forward to let folks then say, well, I can see the bad guy. I can understand the bad guy. I'm looking right at him. I know everything about the bad guy. And if I have authority, should I work on it? That doesn't necessarily have to work its way up. I'll give a counter example. I know I have some friends on the Coast Guard. Their level of decision making is very, very junior. There are some very junior folks with very, I would say, accountable decision making authority. I imagine, and maybe this is like World War II Army versus 1980s Army. World War II Army, a weapons release question and authority would be quite junior. 1990s Army, super senior before any major decision was made. But I think a lot of that was based on the comms, that you had to go back to that central command and control element in decision making. In the flattening of that data, have you seen that tension rear its ugly head in terms of the contradiction between information and decision making over the past 20 years?
Yeah, I think the first part of it is the ability to secure it. So one of the concerns is if you're, if you're going to get information that's of that kind of classification, you've got to be able to secure it. So clearly we have encrypted networks. We're able to bring data down. Now, if you're at a lower echelon, if you're a brigade or battalion, you've got a pretty set battle space that you're working in. And so you're not going to get fed automatically everything. You need to pull what it is you need. So as you have queries, as you have things evolving, the thing is to pull in the information that's relevant to what you need to support your commander, support the decisions that he or she has to make on the battlefield. And so the other part is you can put queries in place that if anything hits in this geographic box, right? So you can geo-define your battle space now, or if anything happens, if there's an emitter, if there's an incident, you can define it and you're going to get things automatically pushed to you. You don't want everything because you're just going to get overwhelmed. But the sophistication in terms of how we push, the ability to pull is amazing these days in terms of what we can get. But you also have to be very leery of the fact that you can't just go, I want everything, because then you're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to be challenged to provide, the right information in a timely fashion to your commander.
All right. So overwhelmed by data at times, if you get too much, let's take a little bit deeper into that and give an opportunity to share some of your stories from wonderful years of service. By my count, and I may be off on this, you appear to have done 6 combat tours. But the question is about how that overwhelmed data has led to predictions of what's going to happen versus what's actually happening. It was shared by a wonderful gentleman on a previous podcast that the role of military intelligence is, or the ambition is, omniscience. But if you have too much data, then you don't know how to wrangle it. It can be overwhelming. And so how to take action on that and turn the I want to know what's happening in the entire operating picture to being able to then act on it, those contradictions between prediction, collection, and the reality. As you look back in your 6 combat tours, what reflections do you have about the role of intelligence and how it's been changing over the time period?
Yeah, like the fact that you can get access to so many things, but you want to make sure that it's relevant. So there's a very symbiotic relationship that you have to have with your commander. And it goes back to something as basic as what you learn when you go to the basic course is commanders have to articulate priority intelligence requirements. What is it you need to know to accomplish your mission? Because I'm going to go out and try to get the information that you need to know. And in some cases, the further you get down to the tactical level, there's a temporal relationship to decision making. At the tactical level, the speed of decision is much faster. At the operational level, a little slower. At the strategic level, you get a chance to kind of kick back in your chair and opine and think about things. And so the fact that you get access to all this information, that relationship in terms of the commander asking what he needs is critical. So I think that is one of the things that you got to have a close relationship, because there's so many things the intelligence community can provide. And if the commander's not articulated those requirements very discreetly and nuanced, then you're going to be dissatisfied with kind of the lack of specificity in the information that's coming back into you. And so it's really important that the 2 and the 3 have a close relationship together. As the 3's planning operations, that the 2 understands those along with the commander, that they're pulling in the kind of information they need for decision making. The omniscience and the predictability piece of that. One of the challenges, whether it's at the tactical level, again, the cycle is much quicker. You look for indications of warning of courses of action from the enemy, right? And as you start seeing those indicators flashing red, you're reducing risk, and hopefully you're seeing them in a time frame that allows you to inform the commander that I think it's course of action A, not course of action B, so that he or she can make decisions. It's much different at the strategic level. If you look at the 4-stars combatant commanders, like we'll say Indo-PACOM, for example, we have questions about, okay, invasion of Taiwan, a blockade. What would some of those Chinese courses of action look like? Well, there's a number of indicators. And so I would imagine that, Admiral Paparo is getting a briefing every morning, and there's a series of indicators, and which ones are green, which ones are amber, and which ones are red, which ones are flashing red that would be of concern to him. And that all those have time horizons. And as much as we try to know when, we can look at the indications of warning, we can look at courses of action, we can look at most likely, most dangerous. But one of the challenges always is when, right? And so you go from ambiguous warning to it could be, to when you start seeing things in that list of indicators where it becomes unambiguous warning. So key things for the intelligence community, whether it's at the tactical, strategic level, is how do I get from ambiguous to unambiguous warning on the problem on the Korean Peninsula, the invasion of Taiwan, or you could go back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because we were really in the unambiguous warning after we had acquired, and the decision from the Biden administration to release the war plan, when we're weeks away from the getting ready to execute. So there's an art and science to all of this.
I'm not an intel officer veteran. I'm obsessively studying this world, and I never thought about it in the context that you're describing. In a way, it almost feels like a pre-search. It's like the levels of PIRs and the level of what your indications and warnings. There's still the intelligence commander's responsibility to say, this is what I need to focus on. I need you all to focus on these scenarios, these threats, these operational requirements. But that direction then yields the data to then make the decision. So there's a chicken and the egg in terms of what you focus the team on leads to the data to make a decision on that. And so it feels like then, and I'm just reflecting back what you said, that the way to ensure that you're even pointing people in the right direction is to have that relationship with the operational actors, the 3. Okay, what capabilities, assets, what's your tasking? What are you commanding over? What's the threat? And then from that, we can then yield the information to make that a more informed set of actions. That does also, though, feel, I guess, thinking back particularly, and maybe this is as a parlay into your work at DIA, though, what you set the information on then can drive the actions, right? The 2 can drive the 3. If you say, I need to get a lot of data on this, and then you end up focusing on a target that may or may not be of timely need. So 2 different questions as I think about what you just shared, and open choose your adventure, sir, if you want to share that from the DIA perspective or perhaps more the Ukrainian look back.
Yeah, so one of the things I did over the past few years is I'd go in and talk to senior leaders about how to interact with their intel analysts. And so I do this, I've done this before when I was in active duty with the capstone course, which is 2-star levels, and then the pinnacle course, which is 3 stars that are going to command. And part of my crowdsourcing is I reached out to a bunch of former bosses and said, tell me about your relationship. And one of the great conversations I had was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford. And he made a comment and he said, before the intel analyst briefs me, to your point about, what are we trying to achieve here? He goes, before the intel analyst briefs me, I need to brief the analyst, so that they understand the mission, they understand the objective, or they understand the policy if they're working at the strategic level. And so for them to be able to go out and get the information that is needed, to General Dunford's point, which I thought was absolutely spot on, he goes, I need to brief them before they brief me. And so the other part of that is going into the role at DIA. So we take our requirements, at the strategic level from the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, which every acronym has a word that goes to it, becomes a noun, right? The NIPIF. And so that's what the president and the National Security Council look and said, the NIPIF are the priorities that we have. And then we take that and we go into the Defense Intelligence Analysis Program, the DIAP. And so we take all of those needs, all those requirements, and we start parsing them all out across a number of different categories. And then we start building collection plans that we work in conjunction with the broader IC, with the combatant commands, and with the services. So it's a very, very deliberate process of making sure that we put those priorities in place because, and this is a little bit tongue in cheek, you can't do analysis on information you don't have. Right now, you do have gaps, and so you do have to analyze your way through some of those gaps. But you got to make sure you're collecting, and at least you have a foundation or some understanding of the problem that you're trying to help, the senior decision maker understand, and whether there are actions they need to take, whether it's a military action at an operational level, or if there's things that need to inform policy at the strategic level.
So, with that strategic direction to then drive some degree of calibration, benchmarking for what to then start collecting data on. I can map it in my head. It does seem to also be, to some extent, the recency bias of strategy. To the extent that 9/11 was a wake-up call, to the extent that there was a long period of developing new technologies at the same time that warfare in places like Afghanistan became a organizational shift towards how work should be done. I'm thinking about one of the lessons you shared earlier. If there's one thing that changed intelligence fundamentally over your time in service, it was comms. Okay, let's talk about comms. Will we have comms in the future? And I think about where the battlefield is going, and I think one of the lessons of Ukraine is broadly the electronic spectrum, the broadcasting natures, and maybe time it with the broad, no specific company identified, just in general. Whole lot of AI, whole lot of tech companies, a whole lot of new capabilities put on drones, whether or not that's asymmetric. But all of that relies on comms. You can't do a search online without Wi-Fi. And so, has that lesson of comms been, is it well understood by the current strategic leader setting those priorities? 20 years of having comms, maybe the next 20, we won't have it as much.
Yeah, no, I think the communications will remain integral. And there's two aspects, right? It's the technical communication, and it's just at the human level, leveling bubbles, I use the phrase, on what's happening. Back to the intel piece of that, we never end, right? It's a cycle. So when the operation is done, everybody high fives, they go back to, their joint operations center, whatever. The intel professionals are still collecting, they're still analyzing, they're still working. Communications is the center piece. That's where you have things like Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC2. That's why the Army is focused on next generation C2, right? And so even when you think about Iron Dome, I could put it in three buckets. It's going to be sensing. You want to be able to get it before it gets off the platform if you're that good. But it's one big bucket is you got to sense the threat, whether it's about to launch or if it's coming in. You got to be able to command and control. In other words, you need to be able to move to the shooter for them to be able to do the third thing, which is intercept. And so communications through the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, our interoperability are absolutely critical. What's changing, even though we think about a threat launching from Asia or Eastern Europe with hypersonics and other kinds of capabilities, that decision timeline is continuing to compress, right? And so, yeah, communications are absolutely critical. So we're getting more sophisticated, but it's got to be secure and it's got to be interoperable. And so a lot of the services kind of built their own capabilities that are not completely interoperable in terms of different kinds of formats and things like that. And then so JADC2 is, okay, how do we make sure that, data through APIs can go into any, network and can be moved. And there are just some tremendous things that have been done. And I know you guys are part of this through the Scarlet Dragon series and what started with General Carrillo when he was the 18th Airborne Commander, and some of the work they're doing and that's an exemplar of, how do we bring in the Joint Force to do targeting at speed, leveraging things like artificial intelligence, automatic target recognition. But that is underpinned by communications, information, and at some point, still someone in the loop making a decision to put still on target.
Well, at the risk of disagreeing with my mentor, and I can see a JADC2 for a Golden Dome interception. That makes sense to me. But would JADC2 help a Ukrainian in a trench who's got a drone coming right at him? Like, I think there's a scale and speed of that data geometry, which I'm not sure would serve a squad level unit that has, weapon inbound, a threat inbound, and can't, call back to JADC2 to help. I guess it's the dimensionality of the threat where I'm not sure that there's like World War I and World War III at the same time. Like, I see the World War I scenario or the world, the intercontinental. Got it. That makes sense. The more forward tech local environment, I'm not sure that nature of warfare is equally served, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a scaling issue, right? So you scale down to the tactical level. Something has to see that, something has to sense it, whether it's an automatic response to shoot it down, whatever the technology you have, because you are physically in that battle space. And so it gets back to that temporal relationship. The threat, the decision cycle is localized for the scenario that you just laid out for these UAVs coming in. Now, the UAV, depending on where you are in the battle space, may have transited lots of different battle space. Someone could have given you a heads up. You may be tied into a radar that looks deeper than what you have in your organic capability, who needs to call you and say, I've got the following inbound, to turn your systems on alert, or somebody in an echelon above you may have the defeat mechanism for those drones. So that gets into the seamless nature between tactical, operational kind of echelons of command and capabilities, where a higher command may be reinforcing to provide force protection for a lower tier. So, and the speed in which some of that's happening, some of these decisions will have to be automated on the cyber level. Cyber defense is stuff that is absolutely automated. And when you look at the Army, when they say, what is one of your main threat vectors that you have to deal with, it's counter unmanned aerial systems. And so if you have a swarm or you have hundreds of drones heading towards you, do you have the capability to defeat that? And right now, that's a work in progress.
I guess from my assessment, what you're making me think about is, and I wish I had a whiteboard so we can do this in a more virtual environment, but I'll just describe it. I see a quad, an X and Y axis. I see big booms versus small booms, and I see dynamic targeting and then deliberate targeting. If it's big booms and deliberate targeting, I think JADC2 and great comms are excellent and make sense there. Once you go to the other diagonal quad of small booms and dynamic targeting, you ain't got comms. In my perspective, from range distance, tyranny distance, a jammer cost $100. I think that's where that was the nature of what I was getting at with the comms question, is that I think the value of comms is provided that organizational structure for the larger, bigger JADC2 Golden Dome type operations. But once you get to the other operational, the inverse, the other quad, that's where I'm curious if the Intel, and maybe this is the future of Intel, and maybe this is the next Gen C2 that you were just talking about. I'm not sure, again, as a novice to this world, that folks understand how underserved that quadrant is.
Yeah, so I think, when you look at the echelons, it's the complexity and the scope of the problem you have to deal with. If I am a platoon leader, right? If I am a company commander, communications are still absolutely critical to me, but they're at the platoon and the company level. So I've got to call platoons that say, that you've got a threat inbound, everybody needs to get in their foxhole. And so it's just the scale of the problem. But communications as a thing is absolutely critical at every level. Just the threats are different. And, just again, it's the decision cycle for drones coming in as opposed to hypersonic missiles. And so it's just a scale issue, but everybody has to be able to communicate.
I guess and this is almost like a therapy session, Bob, as we're going through this. I think I understand why I'm struggling with this so much. Is because for my time in service, I left the Navy as an 03. Very low unit of action, very dangerous forward operating environment. and it was a 12-person team, and we didn't have comms. Some of it was because we're inside a giant ship. And so the radios, MPU-5s don't work to the ship 400 yards away. It's physically impossible with the Faraday cage that is a typical Navy ship, or a ship at sea, rather. And so I think that's my bias. If was like, nah, they're not going to have it. I'm thinking, I actually empathize, but I have no experience in Ukraine at all. So I don't mean to warrant or represent that I have any actual observation of this, but I have an emotional connection to the young 25-year-old guy in the trench in the forward pit of Ukraine. He ain't calling back for help. You can't. You as soon as you click that radio, you're broadcasting your location, and that's the part I'm thinking about. And so that's where I think the science of communications has led to this pervasive threat that broadly, one person in an obscure location on the North Pole, he's fine. But then you throw in autonomous warfare, then you throw in the kinetic nature of autonomous warfare and drones and all these things. The threats are becoming more widespread and smaller. It's no longer just one big boom, is what I meant by, the larger booms of a nuclear weapon. Obviously, now it's, how about 10,000 drones with grenades?
Yeah.
3D printed. And that's where that's the nature of the future of warfare that I'm bringing my own baggage to this conversation. That's what I'm thinking about. I'll frame it as a question now for, how are you thinking about the future of warfare?
Yeah, well, let me get back to your previous one. So one of the pieces of kit, I think it's called the ATAC, is a small PDA, device that's on the chest of a soldier. And they can look at it and get warning and things like that. Low probability of intercept kinds of waveforms, and so that you're not compromising when you get on the radio. But communication at that echelon are going to be critical. I mean, I don't think that ever goes away. And that's a pretty wide open question on your last one, because when you think about the future nature of warfare, I'd say maybe reframe that in terms of what concerns me the most about the future nature of warfare. And I think it's how much of this do we put on autopilot? Because there's a cultural difference. Right now, we've talked very deliberately from a U.S. standpoint that we will not put steel on target, that a human is not in the loop to make that decision. Part of that is what we're coming out of 20 years of counterterrorism, where we could say, I have a voice ID. I have the voice ID correlated to a vehicle. So I know it's that person. I know the vehicle. I've got eyes on through a predator or something else like that. And you can watch. And so you've got almost this 100% confirmation that you're getting ready to drop a bomb on a bad guy, right? And it's, you control the pace of the operations. So set that aside and move into large-scale combat operations where you have major maneuver forces going on the ground. You're going to have to automate some degree or target recognition, where kinetic solutions are going to get launched, I think, at some point. Otherwise, you won't be able to scale and keep pace. Now, the broader weapon systems that may be intercontinental, nuclear, things like that, hopefully you keep the human in the loop on that. I don't think that's going to go away. My concern is some of the more authoritarian regimes may think that they can design those systems in such a way that they'll never make a mistake. Great story is if your listeners want to just Google the man who saved the world. So the man who saved the world goes back to a Russian lieutenant colonel who was on watch duty one night. It was the late 80s. I want to say it was around 88. Guy's named Stanislav Petrov. And and they've got a new system in place for early warning of missile attacks from the US. And he's getting readings that we've got inbound missiles. And so rather than starting the protocol for a counterstrike, he starts calling to his other subordinate units to find out what's going on. And so he does his due diligence only to find out it's an anomaly in this new system. They're getting sunspots or something like that. And so it's a fascinating story to the limitations of technology, that there is always the possibility something could go wrong. That concerns me when it gets into nuclear strikes or things, whether it's tactical kinds of nukes that are on autopilot with Chinese or the Russian or their adversaries. And so I think that's a very interesting story. Or even go back to a movie called Failsafe that was made in 1964. And the whole crux of the movie is trying to recall a bomber that's going to drop nuclear weapons in Moscow based on the protocols and things that are in place and what they should and should not do. Communications which were absolutely integral to that part of it. So I think the debates we're having now about AI, autonomy, and how much we depend on it, and things that could inject that could cause us to go astray are interesting because they're getting unpacked and they're relevant in a movie that was made in 1964 that dealt with, really the Cold War threat of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, those themes are brilliantly threaded together. And so I'll let that insight unpack itself as we round up the podcast here. Final question for you, sir. For folks that want to learn more from you, to seek and engage, what's the best place for them to follow you, engage with you? Are you on the LinkedIns of the world? How can folks seek to learn more about your insights and maybe the next round of mentorship that you are sharing with this community?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not in the public domain in that way. I am on LinkedIn. One of the things I probably should do a better job is I don't really put my thoughts out there with regards to, from a mentor standpoint, it's very personal, one-on-ones with people that I've worked with in the past. And when I engage with young officers or other, people in the Defense Department coming up, I always tell them, drop me a note, happy to chat. So that's kind of for people that I cross, I probably should do a better job of maybe putting some of that stuff out, whether it's on LinkedIn or stuff like that. My wife has always asked me, when are you going to write a book, as some others have? And so we'll see.
If you want to test run a few of the ideas for that book, maybe we'll invite you back to a future episode of Defense Disrupted so you can see which stories land with the broader community. You were also, I'll pull up a plug from earlier. I think you said next year there should be an important report on the Afghanistan lessons learned, a commission report that'll have not literally your book, but at least it may be a contributing author to some of the content there. So I'll advise our listeners to keep an eye out for that when it comes through. And I think, and at the same point, you may or may not have a professional service for folks there. I think you have too many clients, sir, but I have a hunch that you could be well engaged for many years to come.
I have to fight the urge to say, here's my email if you just want to drop me a note. So that may be a little problematic.
Well, we're honored that you were able to take some of that time to share some of your insights here. As always, sir, I am grateful for your perspectives, and we want to thank you again for joining this podcast. So thank you so much for the time.
I appreciate it and always enjoy the chat. And it's good to be able to share some of these stories and hopefully somebody gets something they can take away from it and it helps them out.